Someone who I've known for a long time, has extensive experience, as I mentioned, at the NCAA and conference level. Ladies and gentlemen, Carolayne Henry.
Thanks, everybody, and good morning. This is my first experience with Play the Game, so I'm really honored to be here, and thanks to all of you for coming. David gave you an overview of the NCAA. I will talk about NCAA governance, but I want to hit on a couple points initially and offer you a slightly different perspective. All morning we've talked about the NCAA, the big bad NCAA, student athletes are being exploited, and on and on and on. I was a student athlete. I was not exploited. I played college basketball, and I had the benefit of getting a scholarship from the University of Michigan, and I got to complete my undergraduate education. The value of that education for me and my family, I can't even begin to tell you. I would not have been able to afford to go to university without that. I was an academic student as well. So when we have discussions about student athletes and about the NCAA and about intercollegiate athletics, I'd like you to keep in mind that there is another side to the story. That side does not include every student athlete not graduating. Actually, it's quite the contrary. Typically, student athletes graduate at a higher rate than the general student body. I have classmates, football classmates, one in particular who stands out to me. And I believe we're the norm, not the exception. I'm an attorney. I just hired 2 former student athletes. They're both attorneys, and they're both ethnic minorities. My football friend from the University of Michigan happened to be a lineman. He happened to have almost a 4.0 GPA. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He played pro football for the Chicago Bears, and he's an orthopedic surgeon today. So the NCAA is not all bad, and it provides lots of opportunities. In total, and I think David gave you the number, there are 90 total championships, and 26 of which are in Division I. Football Bowl Subdivision, which is the highest subdivision, and we'll talk about it in governance, offers at least $2 million in scholarship money to athletes on an annual basis. And that goes to their tuition, their room and board, their books, their training, their meals, their travel. There are different funds that allow for student athletes to get money if they need extra clothing, if they need to go home. None of those things typically are discussed. The majority of athletes in my class earn their degree. Athletes do, and they are academic. A lot of time what we see are the exceptions as opposed to the norm. Now, that having been said, doesn't mean that the NCAA should not change some of the things that it's doing. And while I'll be the first to admit that the NCAA sometimes takes a little bit longer to make the changes than we would like, but they are trying to be very thoughtful in each of these changes. The public perception of the NCAA, unfortunately, is negative because that's all that's out there, and I'd like to challenge you to think a little bit differently about the opportunities that are offered to student athletes. And then last, and I'll touch on the California Senate Bill 206 that was passed or signed by their governor, I believe it was about 3 weeks ago. It's effective in January 2023. So that gives the NCAA ample time to review the amateurism rules, review name, image, and likeness, and make a determination as to what might be best for student athletes. There are student athletes on that particular committee as well. It's not as easy as you might think to pay a student athlete. And if you think of the ramifications here in the U.S., say you pay a student athlete, you can go out, you can use your name, image, and likeness. Okay, well, you get paid for that. You get taxed on that. Maybe you change and say you're not football or men's basketball. You change your tax bracket, and now you don't qualify for the need-based aid that makes up the rest of the amount of money that your athletic scholarship's not covering. Those are things to consider. I won't harp on that too much, but I want you to keep that in mind as we have a discussion about NCAA intercollegiate athletics at the highest level, the NCAA governance structure at the highest level, what input student athletes have within that governance structure and what we could do to address some of those questions. As David mentioned, in Division I, there's an overarching structure as it relates to the NCAA itself, but there are also conference structures and institutional structures that are beneath that overarching NCAA structure. From the NCAA perspective, there's a board of directors in Division I that has oversight of all of Division I athletics. There's also what they call a board of governors, and the board of governors has members from all three divisions on that particular committee, and they talk about issues that impact student athletes across all three divisions. The board of directors, the board of governors are very aware of the student athlete name, image, and likeness issue. The board of governors mandated a committee be formed to address student athlete name, image, and likeness in the various different state laws, or the state law that has been adopted and the various other state laws that are in the pipeline. There's also a federal law that is in the pipeline, so all of that is being discussed. And as I said before, the NCAA, while they move somewhat slowly, sometimes slower than we'd like. But that has been mandated, and that is being discussed. And again, it's not like we don't have problems, because we do, but I think they're being addressed. Aside from the NCAA Board of Directors, and there's a Division I council, and on that council are people like me and Ceal, we're not on there now, but individuals who come from institutions, come from conferences, and they go and they try to sit down and figure out some of these issues related to athletes, whether it's student-athlete health and safety, whether it's student-athletes transferring, whether it's use of student-athletes' name, image, and likeness. One of the things that we as an NCAA, and I say we because all of us who are in the NCAA are part of the NCAA, it's not just the NCAA National Office, we're responsible for taking a look at what's happening around us and making change as necessary. With technology and with all the change that's going on, we cannot stay the way we are. I don't know what the right direction is, but we do need to sit down and talk about it as a group, which I think we're doing. We do that at the council level, and there are various different committees if you want to get into sport committees and oversight committees and strategic planning committees, and each one has its own topics that it would discuss. The key sports like men's basketball, women's basketball, and football have their own oversight committees, and I'll stop there for a second and talk about football, men's and women's basketball, and really it's football and men's basketball, which are the elephants in the room, and we've heard reference made to the revenue that each of these sports generates, and that is true, and the role the courts have played in it since 1994, and perhaps the courts or maybe even the government may want to take another role or another stab at it, but that is the elephant in the room, and that's what you see. A small percentage of those student athletes go professional. A small percentage of those student athletes could make money on their name, image, and likeness. The question may be, why not let them make money on their name, image, and likeness in this small space and time? Because that's the only time they're going to have to make money on their name, image, and likeness, and that's what the NCAA working group is looking at. And what's interesting is that the student athletes give us a slightly different perspective. Obviously, they want to make sure that they have their training expenses, their educational expenses, and all the expenses paid that they need, but some of them may want to do something other than athletics when they use their name, image, and likeness, and why should that not be considered? So those things are all also in the hopper. So it's not as bleak as you might think it is, albeit it's going slowly. In each level of the NCAA governance structure, student athletes are involved. So board of directors that I mentioned, there's student athlete representatives on the board of directors. Council, there's student athlete representatives on the council. Each of the various subcommittees are student athlete representatives to get their input, and it's not just soccer player from somewhere. It's football, men's basketball, women's basketball. All the various sports are represented. If you take it down a notch to the conference, and I'll use the Mountain West Conference as an example. We've been around since 1999, for 20 years. And the very first meeting in 1999, we had student athlete representative because we wanted to know what the pulse of the student athlete was. Student athletes met here in town last weekend, and the purpose of that group is to get together and say, okay, what are the issues that are impacting us, and how can we use our voice to make change? Within the Mountain West structure, we have student athletes attend administrative meetings, including board meetings, meetings with our ADs, SWAs, and FARs, and so on. So the message that I guess I'd like to send to you today, that it is not as bleak as you think, and collectively as an NCAA, we will need to work to address the issues. Not denying that there are issues, but there's more than one way to get at those issues. In addition to name, image, and likeness, certain other issues exist, and those are mental health services for student athletes. A lot of times, as Ceal mentioned, our student athletes train really hard and a considerable amount. I remember when I was playing, and we would have morning practices. You would shower, then you go to class, and you come back and you have an afternoon practice. And how do you manage that? How does that work with you from a mental capacity, and who on your campuses can you talk to about that? There are issues as it relates to prospective athletes, early recruiting. Somebody sitting in my living room when I'm a junior, I don't know where I want to go to school or what any of that means. How is that impacting our student athletes? Sports wagering is something in this country that is now something that states can do individually, and then various different legal issues as it relates to the concussion lawsuit, and then NIL again. So those are just some of the issues that face student athletes in addition to NIL. And within the NCAA governance structure, each one of the groups is trying, very hard to address those issues. I will stop right there. I think my time might be up. Okay, good. All right, well then I'll keep talking. Hopefully when we have our debate, I don't know if you want to call it a debate or Q&A, you can ask some specific questions, and perhaps we can address some of the issues that you might have. But I am here to tell you that as an NCAA, as an association, we're working on the issues that David mentioned. Will college athletics exist in the same form that we know it? Maybe, maybe not. But take this into consideration. If we go to a full pay-for-play model, what, if at all, will it look like? And how will that impact student athletes? It may not all be as positive as you might want it to think, because there are a lot of different layers to that should be considered. So I'm going to leave you with that, and thank you guys for your attention.
Thank you, Carolayne, for that perspective. And there are many good things going on in the intercollegiate athletic space, but I do think that the end result of benefiting the athlete, we really need to take the approach of, instead of us, my opinion, what is best for the athlete, because oftentimes that is skewed by the things that I talked about: amateurism, winning, revenue generation. It's more sometimes what is best for us. I'll just leave it with a quote before I turn it over to Andy. Taylor Branch, the famous historian who wrote a seminal piece in the Atlantic called The Shame of College Sports, said it very simply to me when you talk about college, not to me, to everybody, when you talk about college athletes. At the base, you first deal with their rights. Everything else is an adjustment. And it's an adjustment we can make. At the end of the day, we'll still watch the game. So now let's turn it over to sports economist Andy Zimbalist.
Thank you, Dave. So the bad news is that the world is complex. Whether we're talking about human rights and FIFA in Qatar, we're talking about the Semenya case, or we're talking about economic impact in the IOC, the world is a complicated place, and the NCAA reflects that. Carolayne began to explain to you that there are many different aspects to the NCAA. There are 3 divisions. Altogether, there are over 1,000 schools. The division that we're mostly talking about today, and mostly concerns people in the discussion about NILs or pay for play or academic integrity, division that concerns most people is Division 1. That has 350 schools, and it's divided into 3 subdivisions. The top subdivision is called FBS, it used to be called Division 1A, and that has 129 schools. And FBS is divided really not formally, but practically speaking, into two divisions. One is the Power 5 schools, which are the top 65 schools in terms of the how commercialized they are. And then there are the other conferences that are below the Power 5 within FBS. Now, Carolayne talked about the NCAA as forthrightly trying to address the problems that are brought to its attention, and I think that they have tried over the years to do that, and I also think they've failed. And one of the reasons they failed, and I think they'll continue to fail, is because back in 1996, the governance structure of the NCAA was changed. It used to be the case that every school had one vote, and all of the major issues defining the philosophy of college sports would be decided upon by all of the 1,000 plus schools having one vote. Since that time, the allocation of voting power has changed drastically, so that Division I has more votes than Divisions 2 and 3, and within Division I, Division 1A or FBS has more votes than the other two lower divisions. And within FBS, the Power 5 conferences have more voting power than the other members of FBS. So there's a structure within the NCAA, I think, that tells us that those schools that are most commercially oriented and most driven towards revenue maximization are the ones that are controlling decision making. And it's for that reason why we have scandals like we did at the University of North Carolina, one of the top academic institutions in our country, that had a shameless scam going on, creating false classes mostly for athletes, writing papers for the athletes. And when this was all investigated, the NCAA basically said that they're going to leave academic integrity up to the university. The NCAA is not going to touch that issue. And so I think that it's true the NCAA has over time, they've been getting criticism at least going back to the 1890s. And there was a major report in 1929 which was a scathing critique of the NCAA. They've responded to it or attempted to respond to it. Each time they've done so inadequately. I also would like to, because I think it's been obscured a little bit in all of the discussion this morning, say something to you about the economic system that rules in FBS, this top subdivision within Division I. The NCAA every 2 years puts out studies about the economic or financial condition of its member institutions. And it turns out, according to the NCAA's own statistics, that the average or the median FBS school 2 years ago, which is that's the most recent data we have available, had in its athletics department had a deficit of $14.4 million. That's important to keep in mind when you think about changing the underlying labor market for the players. If you think about pay for play, where is the money going to come from? That $14.4 million median deficit is also an understatement of the actual operating situation, because it leaves out a lot of capital expenses and it leaves out a lot of indirect expenses that accrue to the different athletic departments. Now, in addition to this fact of a median deficit, and by the way, let me pause for one more second on that point. The average athletics department, in fact, all athletic departments in Division I and throughout the NCAA don't have shareholders. These are not private corporations. They don't have shareholders who demand at the end of every quarter to see a Q10 report, a quarterly financial report that says there's profitability. That's what a typical shareholder does, because they want the price of stock to go up, they want their dividend to be secured. These athletic departments, which are heavily commercialized, don't have shareholders. There's no private ownership. Instead of having shareholders, they have stakeholders. What do the stakeholders want? They're the alums, they're the townies, the boosters, some of the students. What do they want? They want wins. They want victories. They want their school to win their conference. And so the athletic director structures the department to respond to the stakeholders. Those are the voices that they listen to. And hence, when more contract money comes in, when there's a new television contract, when there's a regional sports network that's generating tens of millions of dollars, as it does in the Big Ten Conference for its schools, what happens? It doesn't flow to the bottom line so it can get distributed to the shareholders. Instead, the athletic director, in order to maximize wins, does something else with the money. They spend the money because they're not allowed to pay the student athletes other than the scholarship program or the cost of attendance scholarship program. Other than that, they're not allowed to pay the athletes. And so what do? How do you run an outfit that's trying to attract good athletes when you're not allowed to pay the athletes? Well, what you do is you spend money on the accoutrements that attract the athletes. You spend money on fancy stadiums. You spend money on fancy, well-known coaches. So you have coaches that go up to $10 million a year with very fancy perquisites on top of that. The median salary of football coaches, the head football coach in the Power 5 conferences 2 years ago was $3.3 million. If you're a high school student and you get a chance to play for a well-known coach, that's one of the things that attracts you to the school. If the school has a new football stadium that costs $300 million with a large scoreboard where your name will be flashed on the screen or there'll be a replay of the touchdown you just scored, that's an attractive point for you. There are many other ways that schools spend money on these accoutrements in order to attract players. So the point being that the underlying modus operandus of the athletic program is such that whenever new money comes in, the athletic director finds a way to spend that. And by the way, the more the athletic director pays his or her coaches and assistant coaches, who these days can also get more than $1 million at the Ohio States of the world, the more they get paid, the more the athletic director gets paid. So athletic directors commonly in FBS these days are getting close to $1 million or some even over $1 million a year. So what you have is a strange economic system that's rooted in the fact that A, there are no shareholders, and B, that the players don't get paid. And it creates a situation where not only there's a transfer of money from the football players to the people who recruit the football players, but there's also a transfer between the revenue sports, which are primarily football and men's basketball, and all the other sports. So a surplus, even though the whole athletic department might be in deficit, the football program at most of these schools does generate an operating surplus. That surplus is used to pay coaches' salaries, but it's also used to support the Olympic sports, the non-revenue sports, and women's sports, Title IX. So when you start thinking about changing the compensation of student athletes, you have to anticipate that it's going to upset the whole apple cart. The whole dynamic within the economic system of college sports is going to be shifted, and hence that too is very complicated. Now let me just say one other word, because Dave mentioned a few times the Drake Group and also mentioned amateurism. The Drake Group is not in favor of pay for play, but the Drake Group does believe that the fundamental principle of amateurism, which has morphed and been redefined multiple times by the NCAA over the years, the fundamental principle is that an amateur plays a sport or engages in some other activity for the love of the activity, not for extrinsic reward, not for money. And so as long as football players and basketball players are not paid a salary for playing on their college team, they're amateurs. What they do with third parties, if they want to make a deal with Adidas or make a deal with Reebok or make a deal with Nike or Under Armour, that has nothing to do with an amateur status. The amateur status is between the player and the employer. In this case, it's not an employer, but it's a university who fills that function. As long as they're not paid for that, they're not violating amateurism. And so the pay for play, the NILS, the name, image, and likeness payment idea, is not one in our view that violates that. And there are appropriate ways to control and restrict the operation of that so it's consistent with the educational process. And one of the things that's important to the Drake Group, and it's important in my conception of college sports, and it's also within the Constitution of the NCAA, which I think they've failed to implement, is that this is all about going to college. There are lots of different kinds of extracurricular activities at college. You can be a thespian in school plays. You could be in the school orchestra or the marching band. You could be playing athletics. They're all supposed to be extracurricular. The main curricular is academics, is education. And in my mind, that's what amateurism is all about in the NCAA. Thank you.
Excellent stuff, Andy, and very interesting lesson on how the financing and funding does work within a nonprofit system. And how it's kind of changed the model in very, very interesting ways. I think we've heard some fantastic things from the panelists, and we have a fair amount of time here for questions. I have some questions that I certainly want to ask, but I want to first open it up for the audience and would love to have as many questions as possible. Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone, and you can address all of us or anybody specifically.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll open up to everyone. Just a little background. I was an NCAA athlete. I'm a graduate student and instructor on the Boulder campus. Seen Ceal around. I just want to ask everyone, given what we know about the NCAA, for those not in the audience, the term student athlete was coined by Walter Byers, the original head of the NCAA, explicitly to not pay workers' compensation to athletes injured and killed on the field. The NCAA and amateurism fought against the idea that, oh, we can give them scholarships now, which we talk about as a great thing. This extra cost of attendance was really fought against a while ago. If I'm correct, even laundry money, oh, that was terrible. That was going to destroy it. Of course, they fought against Title IX. This is going to destroy college sports. Given that they're always behind, they're fighting everything, they're using these same words against the new California bill. They weaponize this idea of pay to play when we think obviously we all should get paid to work. Why should anybody believe that the NCAA is the organization that any of us should trust to take care of these young folks going forward?
Excellent question. I think, why don't we just all take a stab at that, but let's first start with Carolayne.
Sure. First of all, and again, we all are a part of the NCAA. If you are a member institution, it's not the office in Indianapolis. You can trust or not trust. I've been on various different committees, and I can tell you firsthand knowledge that everything that we do is for the benefit of the student athlete. You may hear something different in public. To the contrary, you may hear a very select few student athletes comment on some things, but the majority of student athletes are very happy with their student athlete experience, and they have expressed so. That doesn't mean that there should not be change in the NCAA, but like any organization, change is not going to take place overnight. You may think that everybody is against cost of attendance, for example. That was not the case. There were various different nuances that needed to be worked out first. Again, as I mentioned, the NCAA may take baby steps, but they are taking steps. And I would encourage you to look at it from a different perspective and not the one that's always anti-NCAA.
Karl?
Follow up, Mark Emmert, who was the president of the NCAA, is not the Roger Goodell czar. So, I mean, the structure is totally different. You know, Roger Goodell reports to 32 owners, and those owners are pretty powerful. Mark Emmert reports to, you know, a board of governors, college presidents. So there's a similarity there. But it goes further and deeper into, and let's just get specific to the 130 FBS universities. Those 130 universities, you know, are going to be the final vote to determine whether there's a rule change in any category. So, you know, I was an NCAA staff person for 5 years, and I'd show up on campus, and it was, I mean, 30 years ago, people hated the NCAA. And they still do. And they still don't understand that it's not the, you know, those four letters. It's the NCAA membership that has, you know, evolved into all of these regulatory rules. David mentioned the NCAA rule book early on, 400 pages. It used to be 600 pages. You know, there's been deregulation of the NCAA rule book, but every rule in that NCAA rule book was adopted not by Mark Emmert or a select number of individuals. It was, those rules were implemented by the NCAA membership because someone was probably trying to take advantage of a loophole or some type of a, you know, way to gain a competitive edge. So this notion that the NCAA is the power wielding, you know, force in Indianapolis, or, you know, the behind the cloth and is the Wizard of Oz, you know, that's just, I don't know how we can get rid of that perception, but so that's you know, that's a follow-up. A couple other things just to, I mean that's the general. I mean, I have friends and family members who ask the same questions all the time. Neighbors, people I play golf with, how in the world is the NCAA doing all this? So.
Ceal?
I agree. I think members look at the NCAA is they establish what academic eligibility benchmarks we live by. They establish recruiting rules. They establish the guardrails and the rules by which we operate daily. Whereas the athletic directors, as Andy referred to, they run the business. The athletic directors run the business. They have the pressure of generating revenue and figuring out how they're going to build the next, biggest and brightest, shiniest athletic center. So I think it's unfortunate the NCAA takes the hits that can be shared equally.
Andy?
Well, the NCAA is its member institutions, just as FIFA is its 215 countries that are members. It doesn't mean that Sepp Blatter didn't have power. It doesn't mean that Infantino doesn't have power. The notion that it's college presidents who are overseeing and controlling in some meaningful way what happens in the NCAA is simply historically inaccurate. College presidents have a lot of things on their plate. The average college president is in his or her job for 6 years. They have to raise money for their college. They have to worry about hiring good professors. They have to worry about the happiness of the student body and the alums. They have to worry about the physical plant at the university. They don't have time to invest in reforming the NCAA. There have been some presidents historically that have tried to do that, and they haven't succeeded. And indeed, they've often lost their job as college president when they try to do that. College presidents have basically stepped aside. There are some college presidents who serve on various NCAA committees. These are the college presidents who are attracted to the NCAA and like being around college sports. The NCAA is, in essence, it functions in essence as a trade association for athletic directors, coaches, and conference commissioners. So I think that the people who are involved in the NCAA, present company included, are wonderful people. They have good intentions. They do try to push the ball of reform forward, but they're in a structure that overwhelms that effort. And that effort has failed in the past and will continue to fail in the future.
And I think those are good points. And I do want to just follow up with you real quick, sirs, on the what you said on the rhetoric. And I do want to make it clear that over the years there have been major changes, Title IX being one of them, obviously the cost of attendance stipend. And there has been gloom and doom rhetoric. I want to agree with you on that. And we find a way to make it work. At the end of the day, we still just want to watch the game. So I do want to acknowledge that. You had one follow-up real quick, and then we'll go.
Let's specifically look at some examples. I think Ceal was very correct to talk about it's not just the coach. So the CU Boulder, we're one of those Power 5 schools. We recently hired a new football coach. We fired our other one for losing on the field. Our chancellor decided to email the entire community about it. One sentence about academics, about how our fired football coach led to the best academic performance ever. We have a new president of the University of Colorado system. On campus last week, there was a gross racist attack on some of our students, big demonstrations on campus. Our president doesn't show up for that. He goes to a sporting event to take pictures with alumni. Our head athletic director found out that football coach who was fired for performance on the field 2 years or a year and a half ago promoted an assistant coach who had been assaulting their partner and let that slide, give himself a slap on the wrist. I think it was a week or so unpaid vacation. When we're talking about the NCAA, we're talking about all of that. So I agree, all of that matters. And if we think that's okay and not the front office, we have problems.
Sounds good. I know there's lots of questions here. I want to try to get, I saw the one way over there by that microphone first, and then we'll work our way up. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm an Olympic athlete, and in the 30 years that I've been involved in athlete representation, I've heard people on stages from the governing bodies across sport in all different ways talk to me about the benefits and the positive things they do for athletes. But in the same 30 years I've traveled across the world, Why do you think it is that athletes universally don't trust the bodies that run their sports?
Let anybody take that if they want.
Well, I think they do. I think the athletes that I see every day engage wholeheartedly in their experience, the majority of them. You know, I think there's a feeling amongst the leadership, basketball after 1 year, if you don't want to be a student athlete at a university, you can leave. You can. You have a choice if you want to, if you believe that you can play professionally. But on women's basketball, now, if you're talking football and men's basketball separate from the other 15 sports at the university, I'm around the students. I think they're very engaged. I think they're enjoying their experience. I see them. I just spent an evening with our women's basketball team. When you're looking at a $65,000 scholarship to pay for your education, when they're 17 and their parents come to our campus, they have a choice on accepting the scholarship or not. I look at the very beginning. When they walk in the door, they can accept the scholarship or not. They can choose to come to the university and pay for it themselves, or they can come to the university and have the athletics department pay for it, and they sign a contract. I think they understand, a 17-year-old student and their mom and their dad, I think they understand, I think they do, I've been in this business, I think they understand that when you come, you're going to go to practice, you're going to lift weights, you're going to travel, I think they understand the quid pro quo. I believe that they do. We don't lie about what you're going to do to earn that out of state or we have students from all over the world who come to the university.
Karl?
You know, unfortunately, we hear often, you know, everyone and all, and it's all encompassing. And if there's 350 Division I universities that comprise Division I, represents 100,000 student athletes, it's ballpark number. Of the 130 FBS, which are those football, that gets down to 50,000. If you look just at the football student athletes that come from the Power Five, it may be 6,000 student athletes. And on the basketball side, it's a little bit more probably because there's a greater pool. What I think has happened is that student athletes that have been labeled as high profile, high achievers, potential NFL players, potential NBA players, that the advice and guidance that they're receiving from the time they're 14 or 15 years old is that they are worthy of much more than they're getting. And I think that constant, communication with outside forces and outside influences, from youth coaches to agents to whatever else, I think has tainted, those high-profile student athletes. Nothing was further from the truth 5-6 years ago. University of Connecticut wins the NCAA basketball championship on Monday night. And the most valuable player was a player from UConn. I'm not going to mention his name. Went on to play in the NBA, still playing in the NBA. He takes the microphone, raises up the trophy or raises up his hand, whatever. This is for all the student athletes who go to bed hungry. That is just a fallacy. What I mentioned earlier, student athletes are provided a much better living arrangement on their campuses. And we have been slow, and I say we. The president of the NCAA, the college presidents that that we've all mentioned that have other jobs, the commissioners have had a role over the last 20 years, and I've been around the table, and I've seen we've been slow to act in terms of acknowledging as the revenues increased and as salaries increased, not just to the coaches, but to the administrators, to the on-campus administrators. College presidents' salaries have ballooned because the college president goes to his board and says, we're paying our football coach $4 million and I'm getting X. Everybody's salaries have escalated and compensation packages that have escalated. We are all recipients of that, and I understand that. And I can understand why student athletes who have been that, quote, workforce, but we have made strides, and there are the packages, the financial aid packages that are available today are much more than they were 10 years ago. So we have put cash in the pockets of student athletes. How they use that money, we can't control. But I think that there's been some significant changes made in how we treat and how we care for our student athletes.
Well, I do want to add, though, I mean, and to be fair, Karl, that these changes, albeit slow, knowing the system is bureaucratic, they have been at a point of a bayonet. When the UConn player did mention that, at that time, an extra sandwich was a violation. An extra bag of peanuts was a violation. The bagel and cream cheese debacle, that a bagel and cream cheese was considered a meal. Unlimited food did not come until after that. So I want to be clear on that. And again, the stipend was fought heavily against. And going back to what this young man said, you don't hear me say student athlete because it's not a term of endearment. It is not. It's a term of control.
We have another comment
I'd like
right
to say
here.
real quick, that comment by that student athlete, having been at Final Fours and national championships, he was probably really, really hungry. Their pregame meal was probably at 3. Game time was 7. They're over at 9:30. They didn't get on the dais until 10. He was probably hungry at the time. And, you know, kids say...
We can't speak for the other bodies, but for purposes of the NCAA, perhaps you may want to ask a student athlete. I can tell you the benefits that we provide to student athletes, and they're extensive, but at the end of the day, or even at the beginning of the day, that athlete has a choice. Don't go to college and don't play. Don't take the scholarship.
But what we sin, though, is we say one thing and we do another. That's the one thing that I want to say. We treat our college athletes as employees, but say they're students. But we don't give them the rights that other students have, but we treat as employees and then we don't pay. So for me, it's the messaging. And again, I've also asked thousands of athletes. We have one in the audience here that probably would dramatically disagree with the experience you had, Carolayne. So
I could bring our 2 athletes down that I just hired, but we do not treat our athletes as employees, not in the Mountain West, and we can debate this.
Well,
and
that's not
obviously
what the
this is
National Labor Relations Board said in the Northwestern case. I mean,
Have they been to the Mountain West Conference?
Well, I'm just saying
We don't
that
make quite as much money,
if
I'm
we're-
just saying.
Well, Carolayne, if we're restricting athletes from doing things that students can do, and Andy, you can chime in on this, you're an economist. If we're restricting athletes from doing things that actual students can do, such as profit off name, image, and likeness, that is control. That is a term that meets the employment standard, telling them to stay off social media, all those other things. Andy, you want to chime in on that?
I just wanted to add, with regard to the NCAA, and it's a good question that would take a few days to answer, I think, going through the different associations. But sticking to the NCAA, it's true that athletes are treated better today in financial terms than they were 5 years ago, and 5 years ago, they were treated better than they had been 10 years ago. It happens to be the case that there were 3 major antitrust suits brought against the NCAA since 2005. One was the Jason White case, one was the Ed O'Bannon case, and more recently the Jenkins and Alston case. In those cases, it depends at which level you're looking at it, but fundamentally, the plaintiffs, the people who were suing the NCAA, won, and the NCAA had to respond. And that's the progress. That's the basis for progress. It's not because the board of directors of the NCAA sat around and said, gee, we're making a lot of money. We should share that.
I mean, I guess, and as it relates to lawsuits, they won in part and lost in part, and both appealed to the Supreme Court.
Go ahead, yes.
It's a perfect segue to what I was going to ask is a lot of times, we talk about the NCAA is a membership. And I think a lot of times people forget the stymieing effect that these Supreme Court cases and these other legal cases have had. You know, when you start getting other bodies involved that have other jurisdictions, what can the NCAA do realistically when you have other bodies saying, well, no, but you can do this, but you can't do this, but you can do this, but you can't do this? I think, question for you, Dave, as well as you were talking about going to congressmen and things like that, how does that, things like Tarkanian, the main case that says that the NCAA is not a state actor, how does that get reversed in order to create that real change so that the change doesn't have to be navigated by all of these, you know, by like a canal lock system, essentially?
Well, for me, it's very simple. It shouldn't have to be that way. But as Carolayne said, the system moves slow. The NCAA could have been out in front of this. Groups like the Drake Group have been talking name, image, likeness for 20 years. Unfortunately, the college athletic system, which is based on winning and revenue generation, right, and coaches, as Ceal mentioned, who have tremendous impact, are not hired and fired based upon their academic integrity or the fact that any of their athletes graduate, or Roy Williams and Dean Smith would have been canned 30 years ago. So let's be realistic about it. The only reason we have to go to the legal system and we have to go to Congress is that the NCAA won't make the change. The only reason why we have the no bagel and cream cheese is because of the court case. The only reason why we have something as very simple as transfer freedom is because of the court cases. The only reason that we're having a commission on name, image, and likeness is because of outside pressure. Trust me, nobody wanted to do this, or they would have done it 20 years ago.
The battering ram for all of these other issues that can't necessarily be solved or are being solved outside and not allowing the membership. Now it's just totally choking the system. And
Well,
in
they
which
weren't-
case,
they weren't
how
doing
do we
it.
reform that system to get all those other actors involved so that we don't have to navigate it?
Well, you have to have, unfortunately, you have to have outside pressure. And outside pressure can put the needed aspects so the system itself will change. But the system as it stands right now is not fixing these issues, right? It's not addressing the issues that need to happen. They did not want to do transfer freedom, did not want to do the stipend, or it would have been voted in years and years ago. Yeah, there were some progressive-minded people within the system. I worked in the system. I was one of them. But as the young man said before, it was always this gloom and doom. If we do this, it will ruin college sports. Nothing will ruin college sports. We could pay the athletes tomorrow $1 million salaries. Ohio Stadium, where Ohio State plays, will be filled. Bottom line. We don't care. We don't care whether the kids go to class. We don't care whether they can read and write. So we either make the system what we say it is, or just let it go on its own and just be a paraprofessional system and not worry about it. We'll still watch the games. Actually, this man's been waiting for a while. Then we'll go Nancy next.
Hello. My name is Mark. As one of the overseas guests, I hope you'll just permit me a couple of observations before a question. First off, coming into this, and this will only be resonant for the people who are a little older, some of the things we hear from the NCAA remind me of what used to be said by the record labels. You remember when they used to say that home taping will kill the music industry? Well,
Oh, yeah,
it
same with
seems to be-
VHS.
seems to be that way with name, image, likeness. And now that the colleges are becoming increasingly dependent on the social media presence of the athletes in order to drive engagement around the matches, they're going to have to free up name, image, likeness.
Oh, no, it will happen. And I do want to mention what Andy mentioned with the Drake Group. I invite all of you to go to our website, www.thedrakegroup, that's one word, .org. We have a plan for name, image, and likeness. What I've heard from a lot of my friends who are working in the NCAA said there's no way it can be regulated. It'll open up Pandora's box. Well, everything opens up Pandora's box. You got to stress test the system and see if it works. Will there be unintended consequences? 100% yes. You close those loops as you go. But name, image, and likeness will not kill anything. Again, we're still going to watch the games regardless.
So another quick observation. It seems to me that the idea that an 18-year-old with dreams of playing in the NBA or the NFL has a choice as to whether or not to go into the NCAA system seems a little bit disingenuous. I'm not sure that's a genuine choice.
We'll open it up to the panel. Ceal, you want to address that?
But my question in particular is that, and it's not about basketball, it's not about football, and I think is related to where we are here, Colorado Springs. More than 100 national Olympic committees at the Rio 2016 Olympic Games had team members who had been part of the NCAA system. and who almost certainly wouldn't have had support for their training were it not for the NCAA system. But yet we see that that particular part of the NCAA system is under threat from the revenue sports. Which way do you see support for Olympic sports going within the NCAA system? I'd be really interested to hear your views.
Start with you, Ceal, on those questions.
The first question on choice, I think basketball probably has greater choice. Men's basketball, they could go to Europe, play professionally for a year, then come back, or they can go in the NCAA for a year, then go, or they can choose not to play. I mean, is it our responsibility to determine their professional goals? They have choices. If they want to be a professional basketball player in the NBA and make millions and they're good enough, they could go for a year. They could use our system, right? They can, and they do. And so far, we have not, I'm not opposed to that at any rate, because they have to meet the academic benchmark to get in the first place. So at minimum, they're going to graduate from high school. So I'm not opposed to one and done at all.
Ceal, what about training athletes for other countries that kick our butt in international competitions?
Yeah, that's a big issue that's a big issue. What I've seen, particularly in women's sports with Title IX, meeting participation rates, most institutions, you look at UCLA, they have 58% female undergraduates, so their numbers of women's sport programs are way greater, much more than men. At Colorado, we have 10 women's sport programs and 7 men's to balance out football. What I've seen is increasingly on the women's side, soccer, golf, tennis, women's basketball, recruit internationally because there's not enough undergraduate, or at least they feel like there's not enough to fill the rosters in the United States. So they're in Europe, they're in Australia all the time. Because I can tell you, I approve the expense reports when they're traveling overseas for 2 days to recruit students. We just had I'm probably not allowed to say, but I think it's an international business now. So I think that would be short-sighted to pick a fight in that arena.
Well, let's go to Nancy's question, then Karl, you can pick it up from there.
Well, I wasn't going to say, I just want to clarify that it's not that there are not enough women who want to participate in college athletics. Less than 2% of high school athletics get to any opportunity for both men and women to be able to participate. It is that if coaches are only rewarded for winning, they're going to go out and get the best talent, which is not just here in the United States. But it's not that there's not enough women in the United States. It's not that there's not enough supply.
Yeah, let me clarify that. At the 65 schools, the majority of the NCAA bracket is filled with those 65 Power 5. So yes, they could sign other domestic students, but they choose to. They feel like they have a better chance of retaining their job if they go internationally.
Right. Yeah, but I just want to make clear, it's not because there's not demand here in the United States for those positions, right? There's plenty of women.
At the level that they need to keep their job.
No, I'm not talking about what the coaches, what their incentive is. I'm talking about, are there women who want to play college sports, and is there enough demand? Supply, I should say, if these are the supply necessary for all these schools to fill their teams. It's only 2% of high school sports, and that doesn't include all the club sports. So you're talking, when you add in club sports, you're talking less than 1% get an opportunity to play in college. Anyway, that's not my point.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so what I wanted to, so I'm co-chair of a group called the Committee to Restore Integrity to the USOC, and what we say is that the executive board has figured out how to take those 5 rings and make a lot of money for themselves. And very little of that money trickles down to the athlete. So we're saying that if you had different people who are sitting at the table, you had you had athletes actually represented, not just by people who were 10 years away from their sport, but by people who had expertise in that particular issue, that they would, that different decisions would be made, money would be spent differently. The U.S. Center for Safe Sport would have been funded a long time ago. And I'm thinking that the NCAA is on the same, you get like the people who are voting, they only represent one group. It's just schools that it represents. It does not represent, a 50% bargaining position of athletes or of, anybody else. It is, so that's one reason why you've got to go to the courts or you've got to go wherever else. But if the NCAA had 50% of voting power that came from, let's say, athletes, would they be making different decisions? Would they be more trustable?
Nancy, can you just real quick just add in, and then I want to open up to the panel, but can you just explain for everyone real quick that while we do have athlete representation on NCAA committees, it's been a fairly recent thing, certainly, and that's been influenced by the court cases too, but the Amateur Sports Act and how that influenced athlete representation up to a higher percentage. Can you talk about that real quick?
Sure, yeah. So the Amateur Sports Act passed in 1978 was actually designed to give athletes more power. And it did it in 1972, there were a bunch of debacles that went on in the Olympic movement, and so they gave the athletes 20% of all committees and board positions. So they were supposed to have 20% voting power across the board. An athlete is defined as 10 years post-competition, so I would have aged out at age 32.
Last year.
Right. Oh, that's such a knee slapper. So, the idea is that was great for then, but what Scott Blackman did was he picked his own people of who he wanted to be on those boards, rather than having the athletes pick who they wanted to actually advocate on behalf of athletes. So the current CEO of the USOC, we were trying to give her some space, and sure enough, one of the first things she did, she was hired in August of last year, and then in January, she appoints 2 people that the AAC affirmatively did not want to a 4-year board position. And that was it for the athletes. That was it just took away a lot of the goodwill, because these are, it's the same old, the people who just go along so that the money is all stayed in one place. So in order to get a change on that, you have to go to Congress. You've got to get a new statute. We're supporting this statute or a bill that's been proposed by Diana DeGette, who actually is the representative for this particular area in Colorado Springs, that would form a commission similar to what happened in 1978 that would rewrite the Sports Act.
Yeah, and we're in the Drake Group, we're actually proposing ourselves a presidential commission. So with that being said, if I can paraphrase, Nancy, is while we have athlete representation, we can start with Karl and Carolayne on this, and Andy can then weigh in. But we do have athlete representation. It has increased in the past couple of years because of the court cases. Should we have greater athlete representation using maybe the model of 10 years out, not just current athletes?
Right, and athletes that are chosen by other athletes, but not just young athletes, right? So the NFLPA doesn't depend on NBA players to do the right. They hire professionals who are good at that, who are on the same professional scale as the CEO of the corporation, right?
Right, and I often hear, and I don't doubt, Carolayne, that we want what's best for the athlete, but I think the athlete should have a greater voice in saying what's actually best for them. And I don't feel currently in the structure that they have that, but correct me if I'm wrong. Carolayne, if you want to start, and Karl?
Sure. First of all, the court cases did not determine whether or not the NCAA added more student-athlete representative to the committees. The student-athletes advisory committees actually asked for more. I think in the Autonomy 5 conferences, you have even more than I think the NCAA in your small conference, and we do as in the Mountain West as well. But I would not oppose additional student-athlete input. they've been very helpful to us in our conference when we have them at our meetings and have changed decisions and changed minds on a lot of different things. So that is not something that I would oppose. I don't know. That may be one of the easier things that the NCAA could do.
Karl?
Just in general, I think that the conferences, and I'm purposely not saying the NCAA, I'm saying the conferences are not opposed right now to, exploring, examining the restrictions that are in place. The NCAA and the membership has blundered tremendously in the past when it comes to restrictive. The most glaring was 15 years ago, we labeled a group of assistant coaches as restricted earnings coaches. I mean, that was just an absolute debacle. And we paid for it. We paid handsomely for it. And those assistant coaches got, But I think that I think the point that I'd like to make is that the restrictions within the system so that we don't damage and reduce the opportunities that we've provided. And how can the system, if we change the system, how can it then be replayed so that the track and field programs in the U.S. are not endangered, and that women's opportunities are not endangered, and that an athletic director is forced to make financial decisions on the backs of men and women student athletes that are currently getting this opportunity. And again, I hate to say generalization, the number of student athletes, and they are true student athletes in the wide majority of the cases, are there to get a degree, and they take their education seriously. And when they walk across the stage to get their diplomas, they are proud that they were able to balance the demands of being an athlete at the same time. So, please go back to your various countries. There are happy and satisfied students who just happen to be able to compete in intercollegiate athletics because of the system. We're trying to meet those needs, but if we just open the gate, the floodgate, there may not be enough resources behind it to continue the same level of participation and opportunities that we provide.
I have a question for Andrew, actually, because you mentioned that there is a $14 million deficit at institutions right now, or on average. Is the current model sustainable to allow for pay for play for everybody, or would we have to change the offerings such that there would be fewer sport offerings so that the revenue generators could get paid?
It's $14.4 million median deficit in FBS, and I think it's going higher. And that deficit does not include most capital expenses, and it does not, for instance, include a share of the president's or the chancellor's salary or their secretaries or the buildings, the rent in the building. So there's really a very substantial financial hole that's left from intercollegiate athletics right now. And if you were to go to a pay-for-play system in which the athletes got a salary, not nils now, which is about third-party payments, but athletes getting paid a salary by the institution, then the deficit would grow. Now, what would happen over time, and what's happening now is that the multi-million-dollar salaries that the coaches are getting is they're getting paid for the value that's produced by the athletes. So once you allow, or if you allow the athletes to be paid, the deficit wouldn't grow by the amount that the athletes were paid, because the coaches will get paid less over time, and the athletic directors and conference commissioners would be paid less. But that's an offset that would happen over a long period of time. In the short and medium run, there would be much larger deficits, and that means that the educational institution, the educational budget, would have to subsidize athletics to a greater degree.
And if the budgets could not be subsidized, then sports would likely be cut so that the institutions could meet the demand.
It's likely that one of the choices that institutions would make is to reduce the deficit or prevent it from growing by reducing the number of sponsored sports, for sure.
Which we as a country would then have to address and potentially come up with alternative models should that happen. I know you've already asked a question, so I want to give somebody else a chance real quick over there. Melissa?
Hi, thanks for this discussion. It's been really helpful. I'm Melissa Eggleston. I'm from Teamworks, here learning more about athletes. And you started to get into it a little bit. I'm curious about this image and likeness issue that looks like it will end in some kind of payment or some kind of something going on with the athletes. How does it affect different athlete groups? The Olympic sport groups playing versus the athletes, football and basketball, versus other different groups, women's sports versus men.
Well, let's start with Andy first on that one, since he's the economist, and we'll work our way down.
So this is a matter for the private sector to determine. Corporations or local companies that feel that associating their products with the athletes who get to be well known at a particular school will offer deals. The star football players and the star basketball players are likely to get many more offers. It's not to say, however, that an Olympic athlete who has made a name for herself or himself wouldn't also get called up by a local GM automobile dealership and say, we'll give you $5,000 if you make the following 10 appearances for us. It will also vary a lot by the school. Some schools are located near big markets, and some schools are located in rural, isolated areas. And the larger the market, obviously, the greater the value of any endorsement contract would be.
I think one of the other things, aside from, whether you're in small town and you're talking about the local burger shop wanting to sponsor you, social media. A lot of our student athletes already come to us and they're social media influencers. How can they use their name, image, and likeness in that manner? And that could impact whether it's Olympic sports, football, men's, women's basketball, more team-oriented sports. All of those are areas that a student athlete could potentially use his or her name, image, or likeness, and it doesn't necessarily have to relate at all to athletics.
The O'Bannon case has been mentioned a couple times here this morning, and I think we have to remember that was kind of the first time that it had been addressed. And the judge ruled in favor of O'Bannon, and her ruling was that each student athlete would be able to receive up to $5,000 based on name, likeness, image put into a trust. And the NCAA responded, and David, as you said, have reacted to all these influences and came up with a pretty good alternative that was going to benefit all student athletes, which is the cost of attendance. And in light of that, the original ruling was passed on, and the NCAA adopted this cost of attendance that put money, cash, into the pockets of every student athlete, regardless of sport. It wasn't market driven. It was an influx of cash, anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000 or $5,000 a year. So that was because the fear was that only the select few student athletes would ever have value enough to generate the $5,000. So now we are 5 years later, ready to open up the door. And one of the fears, and this gets to your question, sir, is that athletic directors fear that whatever money is taken out or whatever money is given to the student athletes by local donors and sponsors will be reduced to what goes into the university fund. And that's their fear. And if that happens, then they've got to balance their budget or go further deficit, Andy, to make sure that they have enough resources to sponsor all these sports.
Can I just clarify one thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Karl said that the NCAA came up with the idea to extend the cost of attendance. That's not true. The district court, by Judge Wilkins, issued a two-part opinion. The first part of the opinion was to allow cost of attendance to expand as long as the expenses were educationally tethered. And the appeals court in the Ninth Circuit upheld that. That was separate. That's not an NCAA idea. This was something that came out of the O'Bannon, all of the plaintiff arguments in O'Bannon, and it was ratified by the judge. Then Judge Wilkin also said, as Karl mentioned, that athletes could, when they graduated or left school, they could get up to $5,000 in nil payments. That was rejected by the Court of Appeals. But I just want to clarify that this was not an idea that the NCAA stepped forward and say, hey, why don't we do this so we can provide more people the benefit. And in terms of the fear that Karl mentions, that maybe Nike will decide, instead of giving $5 million to the University of Michigan, they'll give $4 million to the University of Michigan, and they'll parcel out to the 5 best football and basketball players endorsement contracts. And so it's possible that if we adopt a nil system, the athletic departments will get less money, and that's true. And so what?
Yeah, and I say maybe we don't build lazy rivers and miniature golf courses, which we're
Andrew,
doing.
the NCAA did have to adopt and approve and pass the cost of attendance. So it wasn't mandated by Judge Wilkins or the court that we adopt cost of attendance. It was in an attempt to compromise, to work with the legal system, and I think that the fact that it put money in the hands of a much broader group
The NCAA
was a
had to
good
adopt
result.
it. They had to adopt it, or you'd be in violation of the antitrust laws.
I think that's probably true. Ceal, you've been waiting.
Well, it's not just about money, it's about winning. And the coaches are going to use this as an incentive for recruiting. And if you're in a market, I'm not sure I agree with Andy, the larger markets, you're competing with the pro sports. If you go to states where the flagship university does not have to compete with any professional sport program in their entire state, all those donors, boosters, they're lining up to line the pockets of the prospects that the institution is recruiting. And they can do that legally, and they can tell those parents and that student, we've got 7 people that will pay you X amount, and that's going to incentivize them to go to that university. So I think one of the big concerns as a membership isn't just a loss of revenue, because you are going to lose. Our budget is 30% conference distribution, 30% ticket revenue from football and men's basketball, and 30% donations and sponsorships. Those donations and sponsorships will go down for sure, so that's a concern. But also, we're in a market where we compete with the Denver Broncos, so I'm not sure that, we're going to have the same donors lined up that maybe another institution that doesn't have pro sports in their backyard is going to have to compete with to have their supporters to incentivize those 17-year-olds to come to their school.
Well, something to think about. So unfortunately, we're running out of time. I wanted to make sure anybody who hasn't asked a question, I want to be fair. We'll go with, and you'll be our last question, and then we'll be up here as a panelist, or out in the audience. You can ask us directly. I apologize. So our last question.
Yeah, I'm Nenadic from Serbia, Europe, and I like your problems because actually you are so superior. And due to NCAA, you're the leaders, on global leaders in sports. So somehow, a question for you. Do you like that you have dysfunctional students like we have in Europe who doesn't have even physical activity, or you like your functional students in this dysfunctional marriage?
Very well, let's let everybody take the last word on that. Ceal, you want to start?
I like our system. It's got flaws, but I like the fact that they have choices.
Karl?
Agree. I mean, it's we're the beneficiaries of 40-plus years of it. I hope that there's another 40 years that that the children in this generation can have the opportunity to participate in college sports, and if that evolves into international sports and the USOC, or if it evolves with the professional sports. So I think that it has worked in the past.
Carolayne?
Yeah, I agree as well. We have a lot of work to do, but we always do manage to get it done.
I think as long as we don't forget about education, we have a good system. It needs to be drastically reformed.
And I get the last word. I say that I agree in many ways with what everyone has said. I think that there is a place for educationally based elite sport development in America. However, I do feel that we also need more choices and more models, but we need to focus on the rights of the athletes first. That's where I'll end it. This was a great panel. Thank you very much for everybody. Give them a hand. Thanks for your attention.